Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Joanne Kilgour, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio River Valley Institute. As folks are logging in and we're waiting for everyone to join, I'd like to cover just a couple of technical notes. The first is that we are recording this session for those who are not able to join live. So if you're joining here, this will be recorded. In addition, we've enabled closed captioning for this event for accessibility purposes. So if you'd like to turn on closed captions, there's a live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to enable that function. I'd like to thank and introduce you to Ben Hunkler, who is the communications manager for the Ohio River Valley Institute. Ben has coordinated this event and is on today in case you have any technical issues with the meeting. So thank you, Ben. The format of today's event will begin with a presentation from our research team at Strategen, and then we will bring in Sean O'Leary, senior researcher at the Ohio River Valley Institute, to join them for a panel discussion. Following that panel discussion, we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So if you're joining as a participant and you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A or chat function, and I'll do my best to see that we get through as many questions as we can in the time that we have. If for any reason there are questions we don't have time to address live, we will make sure to follow up with you directly, or you can reach out to myself or Ben or Sean, and we'll see that you get a response. Great. Well, we have a wonderful number of participants today. We're thrilled to see the interest in this report release. And I would like to just thank you all for joining today as we release a clean energy pathway for Southwestern Pennsylvania. This is a new decarbonization pathway for the 10-county region of Southwestern Pennsylvania that would boost employment and reduce harmful climate warming emissions more effectively and at a lower cost than other pathways that are based on natural gas resources paired with carbon capture technology. This analysis focuses on the power sector as the backbone of the region's clean energy transition, leveraging non-emitting resources, including wind, solar, and legacy nuclear, energy efficiency upgrades, increased electrification, and energy imports to minimize the need for polluting fossil fuels while maximizing emission reductions and job growth. Today, we're thrilled to be joined by two of the report's lead authors at Strategen, Joe Goodenberry and Eliasid Animas, as well as Sean O'Leary from the Ohio River Valley Institute. Joe Goodenberry is a senior manager at Strategen, where he provides project management, economic analysis, and technical expertise for engagements involving decarbonization strategy, resource planning, emerging technologies, and economy-wide implications for the transition to a clean energy future. He has extensive experience in capacity expansion and production cost modeling for the electric grid, economic impact and job creation studies, wholesale electricity markets, and environmental policy analysis. Prior to joining Strategen, Joe served as the lead economist at the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association and previously held positions at FTI Consulting and LECG, where he provided economic consulting and litigation support for wholesale electricity market design and market power issues. Joe holds a master's degree in environmental economics from the University of Georgia and a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Ithaca College. Thanks so much for being with us today, Joe. I'm also pleased to introduce Eliasid Animas, a consultant working primarily in Strategen's decarbonization strategy practice area, where he helps utilities, technology companies, governments, and NGOs to trace and achieve their clean energy and decarbonization goals. His expertise includes analysis and planning of energy resources, cost, benefit, and storage dispatch analyses, evaluation of long-duration storage, distributed energy, and peak energy technologies, and experience working on Western markets and structured energy markets. Prior to joining Strategen, Eliasid worked in the development sector as an urban planning consultant and collaborated with academia, local governments, and developers on projects related to energy efficiency, economic development, and transportation. Eliasid holds a BA with honors in urban and regional planning and is training in business administration at UC Berkeley as a Fulbright grantee. Thank you both so much for your work on this report and for joining us today. Joe, I'll now hand things over to you to discuss the details of this analysis.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joanne. Hello, everyone. As Joanne mentioned, I'm Joe Goodenberry. I'm the Senior Manager with Strategen Consulting, and today my colleague and I, Eliasid, will be talking about our analysis to create a clean energy pathway for this region. Just some very brief background on Strategen. We are a globally connected, impact-driven firm on a mission to decarbonize energy systems. Joanne provided a pretty extensive intro for both Eliasid and I, so I'll skip over any of those additional boring details and get right to it here. So for this engagement, our focus was to develop a future clean energy pathway for a 10-county region in the southwestern corner of the Commonwealth. Today, we'll be walking through that analysis, focusing on some key takeaways and providing additional detail on assumptions, methodologies, and findings. Just a bit of background here on the study region. This is an area traditionally known for production of fossil fuels, particularly coal and in recent years, natural gas, of course, as well as the use of fossil fuels in electric power generation. As a result, it's also associated with high levels of local and greenhouse gas emissions that originate from this region. And a focus for this study was primarily the power sector. Generation from this 10-county region is actually twice the level of electricity consumed, meaning, of course, that it's a net exporter of energy, and more than 70% of the generation is produced using fossil fuels, again, primarily coal and natural gas. So I want to start off here just by taking a moment to go through our approach. Our analysis is intended as an alternative to other regional decarbonization proposals, which rely quite heavily on natural gas and carbon capture. And our pathway, therefore, differs from those scenarios in a few key ways that really make it unique. First, our analysis is centered around zero emissions resources, as Joanne mentioned, particularly wind, solar, hydropower, and storage, as well as existing nuclear, with the goal of achieving deep reductions in power sector emissions. So as part of doing so, we believe that leveraging power sector imports can help arrive at a more optimal solution. As I mentioned on the last side, the region has historically been a net exporter of electricity, generating more than is necessary to meet load, and as a result, the region has been bearing more of the energy burden, particularly from an emission standpoint. So our analysis doesn't assume that local load needs to be met solely by local generating resources, and instead we allow for imports from elsewhere in the PJM footprint, which also allows us to leverage cleaner resources from areas rich in renewable potential. As part of a larger economy-wide decarbonization strategy, our pathway includes electrification of both the buildings and transportation sectors. That obviously will increase electricity load, but it will also enable emissions reductions in these sectors as the power sector continues to get cleaner over time. The fourth area of focus here is on energy efficiency. We model a pretty heavy dose based on economic potential in the region, and this doesn't just reduce electricity load and avoid emissions, but it also provides benefits for the local economy through job creation and bill savings. So as I alluded to earlier, our focus for this analysis was primarily on the power sector. We'll get into a bit more detail later in the discussion, but our overall methodology was to analyze local hourly demand and resources, technical potential, and cost forecasts. And we incorporate these data into an in-house modeling tool, which we use to simulate the dispatch of the electric system in the region. This allows us to balance electricity load and supply and identify resource needs, particularly for dispatchable technologies. And so at a high level, our analysis found that there is a very real opportunity here to move the region towards zero emissions resources. We actually find that our renewables-based pathway, including significant investments in energy efficiency and clean energy imports from PJM, can be more cost-effective than continued reliance on fossil fuels. Specifically, we find that by 2050, it's 13% less expensive than an alternative strategy focused heavily on natural gas paired with carbon capture. And further, our modeled pathway for the region would avoid the need for expensive investments in carbon capture infrastructure while limiting exposure to fuel price volatility and mitigating the risk of stranded fossil fuel assets. Not only is our pathway potentially cheaper, but it's of course also cleaner. In our analysis, all coal plants in the region are retired, as well as a significant portion of the natural gas plants. We do have a limited portion of the gas kept online for capacity and for peaking needs to ensure reliability, but we aren't pairing it with CCS, and it's running so infrequently that we reduce annual power sector CO2 emissions by 97% by 2050. And then with electrification of the buildings and transportation, we lower CO2 emissions for these sectors by 95% over the period. The total annual value of environmental and health benefits associated with combined reductions from the power, buildings, and transportation sectors comes to $4.2 billion in 2050, measured through avoided social costs. So these savings help further the case for a clean energy pathway as a least cost option for energy transition. And then through reduced reliance on natural gas for power generation and use in buildings, our decarbonization pathway will substantially decrease consumption of natural gas for these two sectors. Lower consumption provides an opportunity to reduce emissions associated with natural gas extraction. So if we assume that this drop in consumption leads to a corresponding decrease in production, we see additional value of avoided environmental damages of more than $1 billion in 2050 alone. And lastly, as I mentioned, the multifaceted benefits associated with energy efficiency. In our analysis, energy efficiency measures reduce electricity load by an additional 2.6% each year on average, which helps offset the additional load through electrification. So by 2050, we see net growth in electricity load of 33% over the period. And then, of course, those economic benefits I mentioned. As part of our work here, we specifically modeled the job creation potential associated with energy efficiency expenditures and resulting residential bill savings. And we find that investments in efficiency measures can support more than 15,000 annual jobs within the region by 2050. And additional analysis of economic multipliers specific to this 10-county region finds that energy efficiency has a greater potential for economic development compared to both power generation and fossil fuel extraction, leading to more higher paying jobs served by workers and suppliers who are local to the region. So these are some pretty telling findings with some compelling implications. So as we continue the conversation here, Eliasid and I will dig in a little bit more on some details and of our analysis and some results. So I want to start off here just to briefly talk through our assumptions and approach for electrification and energy efficiency. Our analysis did focus primarily on the power sector, but we also examined decarbonization of both the buildings and transportation sectors in the region to understand how they would impact electric sector and energy load, right? So for residential buildings, we estimated the rate of electrification under the assumption that household heating systems and appliances would be converted based on average life expectancies. So we employed data from EIA's Residential Energy Consumption Survey, or RECS, on the current age of this equipment in the region. Then over time, it's replaced with electric equipment as it reaches the end of its life. For commercial buildings, we didn't have the same detailed data available on equipment age, so the timeline for conversion was based on the trajectory from Princeton University's Net Zero America study, which ultimately results in 90% of commercial buildings being fueled by electricity by 2050. For heating systems in both residential and commercial buildings, we assumed that replacement would involve conversion to cold climate heat pumps, which do offer an improvement in efficiency. DOE references a 50% improvement, so that's what we assumed here for this analysis. For transportation, we assume that light duty vehicles are converted to EVs by 2050, and to do that, we based our trajectory on California's mandates with the requirement that by 2035, all new sales of light duty vehicles would be zero emissions. And so as the vehicle stock gradually turns over throughout the period, older vehicles are eventually replaced with new ones as they reach their end of life. For medium and heavy duty vehicles, we similarly based our assumptions on California's proposed advanced clean truck rule. And by 2050, we see 96% of this fleet transition to zero emissions. So with that electrification trajectory developed, we were able to determine the resulting impact on electricity load within the region. But we also did allow for energy efficiency improvements to reduce electricity load. I mentioned that we included increased implementation of energy efficiency measures, and we based that on economic potential. And so by economic potential, what we mean is we're assuming here that all technically feasible and cost-effective measures would be implemented in our pathway. And so based on our assumptions, we assume that each year load is decreased by an additional 2.6%. This is applied only to existing loads and not new load created through electrification, since we don't want to be double counting any efficiency gains that are already occurring associated with electrification. So the graph I've included here does show the impact of both electrification and efficiency measures. Our starting point is 2022, and then net of both of these, we see load growth over the period of about 33% by 2050. So although there is a big impact from electrification, there's also a pretty large impact from energy efficiency, as we can see here on this graph. So these pieces of analysis were applied to baseline load in the 10-county region. At this point, I want to hand it off to my colleague, Eliasid, and he's going to talk through how we're defining the local load profile, and then he'll walk us through the energy supply assessment and our dispatch simulation. So Eliasid, take it away.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, so, well, the first step of the analysis was precisely that, the characterization of the region's energy demand. And this is not only its magnitude, but also knowing when and how the energy is being used. So this was an interesting question for us because most of the data related to energy consumption is currently compiled for the utility service territories or at the state level. Because of this, we use a bottom-up approach developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL. They use the building stock, regional weather data, statistical energy consumption samples to create these subnational energy models. So both the RESTOC model for the residential sector and the COMSTOCK model for the commercial sector were used in this analysis. Both of these models allow us to calculate the amount of electricity and thermal energy used at the county level and to simulate the load profiles that were used in our analysis. We also use data on the power used by the industrial sector. Again, data and models by NREL were used. But for the industrial sector, we did not include thermal energy demand as it was the focus of our decarbonization pathway. We're leaving that for another time. So as you can see in this graph, the lines represent the aggregate electrical and thermal energy demand in the 10-region county. So the green line is the electricity load, the blue line is the gas demand. And for references, the shaded areas behind show the power generated during 2021. As you may have already noticed here, the region generates more than twice the energy it consumes, and most of the energy comes from fossil fuels. To project these loads into the future, we incorporated the impacts of electrification and energy efficiency, as Joe explained, but assumed that the demand won't grow based on economic and demographic drivers. And this assumption was confirmed by recent trends of the region and the utilities forecast for the wider region. Next slide, please. So the second step was defining the load profile. So after defining the load profiles, we look at ways to serve those loads using existing and new power generation resources. This included the existing and aging thermal fleet, which we assumed retirements based on the age of the assets, about 50 years for coal and in between 30 and 50 years for different gas turbine technologies. Since the region is currently a net exporter of power, we assume that coal and gas plants were retired, and as that happened, the region can still use the transmission capacity to import cleaner energy. Based on our approximations, we assume that somewhere in between 7 to 8 gigawatts of transmission capacity could be made available by 2050. In the case of the new resources, the renewables, we looked at existing assessments of the potential to develop renewable energy facilities within the region and throughout the wider PAM interconnection territory. We defined the technical and economic potential of solar, wind, and hydro, and use a share of that to set upper limits to the deployment of renewables that were then fed into our analysis. To characterize these new loads, we selected multiple sample locations based on resource availability and existing project proposals, as you can see in the graph, to pull generation profiles that actually reflect real weather patterns that translate into intermittency and seasonal availability of the renewable resources. Finally, we pulled cost forecasts for energy generating technologies from the NREL annual technology baseline, and also embedded the expected benefits from the Inflation Reduction Act on it, just to have both the magnitude, the shape, and the cost of all these sources of energy. Next slide, please. So finally, the collected data was fed into our in-house tool. The tool simulates the dispatch of energy in an hour-by-hour basis. And what it does is that the model resolves the imbalances between clean energy supply and regional demand by estimating the need for additional dispatchable energy. This is defined as energy storage, natural gas, or imports, depending on the availability of such resources. The calibration of the preferred resource portfolio was done through an iterative process that considered the cost, the emissions, and the transmission limits of the solution. And since the process was performed outside of the model, the resulting portfolio is not fully optimized and represents only one of many potential solutions for the power challenge of the Southwestern Pennsylvania region. So each of the three graphs on the right show 3-day snapshots of the energy dispatched during the different seasons. During the winter, for example, on top, the region's demand peaks, and there is a multi-day need for dispatchable energy, as you can see from the red shaded areas. On the contrary, during the summer, the second graph, most of the region's power needs are met by renewables and storage alone, with excess energy that can be exported to other places. Also, in the last graph, it's showing the shoulder months, and here you can see a more active dispatch of energy storage, which can be further deployed to provide grid services, for example. Next slide, Joe, and I guess back to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eliasid. So as we move on to the results of our analysis, we see the transition here in the generating capacity over the period. By 2035, all coal units have been shut down, as you see, and we're able to retire much of the gas as well by 2050. For balancing and reliability, there is a need for some natural gas or other dispatchable resources to remain on the system. As you can see here, we have left just about 2 gigawatts of capacity, a little bit under. But even these resources have the potential for future decarbonization through possible advancements in technology such as green hydrogen or other forms of seasonal storage. So we kind of have it shaded in gray in 2050 here. For now, the placeholder would be natural gas for reliability and to be maintained as a reserve. But as we see here in this next graph, even that capacity wouldn't be running all the time. In our analysis, by 2050, remaining gas is only dispatched consistently during the winter and mostly serves as a peaking resource during the rest of the year. And, in 2050 here, you can see we switched the color to orange, indicating that potential for the dispatchable generation to become clean, with such technologies and maybe long duration storage or green hydrogen. This graph also shows the progression over time. As we see coal retire, initially natural gas fills that role and then runs less and less with future renewable development. The other main piece here is the region's transition from a net exporter of electricity to a net importer through that ability to leverage clean energy resources from areas with high renewable potential throughout the PJM system. By the end of the period, a little over 30% of local load is met by supply imported from outside the region. We also see here the increasing role for energy efficiency. I mentioned this at the top of our discussion. We do see load growth resulting from electrification, but efficiency helps minimize that impact. And in our analysis, load grows by 33% overall by 2050. And one of the most interesting findings from our analysis is that our clean energy pathway can actually be lower cost than a pathway that relies on local natural gas resources paired with carbon capture. For this piece of the analysis, in order to compare costs, what we've done here is developed an alternative gas plus CCS scenario as a sort of representative example of some of the other decarbonization pathways that have been developed and proposed for this region. For this alternative side case, we included most of the same inputs that we incorporated into our primary clean energy analysis, except for this side case scenario. We didn't retire any natural gas plants, and instead we paired natural gas resources with CCS. We also included less aggressive energy efficiency assumptions, and we backed off of imports and assumed that local load would be served primarily by resources within the study area. And then we calculated the per megawatt hour costs of electricity supply for both scenarios to compare cost effectiveness. As I mentioned at the start, we found that the clean energy pathway is 13% less expensive than this gas plus CCS side case, showing that a renewables-based pathway not only can be cleaner, but it can also be more cost effective. And so I want to take a moment to talk about the emissions reductions in our analysis. The chart shows the drop in CO2 from the sectors that we examined. For the power sector, we see that emissions decreased by 92% by 2035 and 97% by 2050, driven, not surprisingly, by coal plant retirements and over time, substantially backing down on natural gas generation. For the power sector, we end up with about 1 million tons of CO2 emissions remaining by 2050 on an annual basis. For that gas plus CCS side case that I just described, it's about 2 million tons of CO2 remaining at the end of the period. So as I said, our clean energy pathway based more heavily on renewables and imports and energy efficiency ends up being the cleaner pathway as well. For the buildings and transportation sectors, electrification greatly reduces those CO2 emissions. For the three sectors combined, our analysis is cutting emissions by 77% by 2035 and 96% by 2050. And so to quantify the impact of these reductions, we're employing social cost of carbon estimates based on guidance from the US EPA to estimate the value of these benefits through avoided costs associated with climate change. We see that the impacts here are pretty substantial. For these three sectors, the annual benefit of CO2 reduction surpasses $4 billion. And one additional benefit I did want to consider here as well, I referenced that the decreases that we see in natural gas consumption from the transition of the power sector and electrification of the building sector, that totals about a drop of about 500 billion cubic feet annually by 2050. And so if that drop in consumption did lead to a drop in natural gas production, we'd see additional environmental and health benefits from reduced emissions associated with natural gas extraction. A study conducted by researchers at Carnegie Mellon University estimated that the production of natural gas in the Appalachian Basin results in air quality and climate damages valued at $2 per 1,000 cubic feet through the release of CO2, methane, and other local pollutants. So applying these estimates to the drop in consumption and potentially drop in production, we see additional annual benefits reaching about $1 billion in 2050. Some additional benefits here for the local economy. There's existing research out there suggesting that electricity created from renewable sources creates more jobs per unit of electricity generated than power produced from fossil fuels. There's also been some analysis finding that investments in clean energy create more jobs than fossil fuel investments, with energy efficiency investments providing particularly strong benefits. So for this portion of the study, we at Strategen, we did some additional modeling on job creation, focused specifically on energy efficiency. And so our approach was to conduct economic impact analysis using economic multipliers. This allows us to track how spending in an industry can flow through the economy and stimulate economic activity across multiple sectors. This is measured through the direct impact, so jobs or economic activity in the sector where the spending occurs. And then we also have indirect effects where we see how initial expenditures impact other industries in the supply chain. And then there's induced effects, which include the impacts of employees in the direct and indirect industries spending in the local economy. So for every dollar spent in an industry, it generates direct, indirect, and induced economic activity. And multipliers basically allow you to quantify those impacts by telling you, for every dollar spent in one area of the economy, how many jobs or how much labor income will that spending support? So what we did here was we obtained multiplier data from the US Bureau of Economic Analysis, specific to these 10 counties in our study region, so that we could model that local impact. But the BEA data, they don't have multipliers specific for energy efficiency as an industry, because energy efficiency involves multiple industries. So we developed our own multiplier based on the multipliers for those relevant industries. You know, that's heating equipment, electric bulbs, appliances, retail sales, repairs and maintenance. I'll encourage folks to read through this section of our report for additional detail on this, but you know, ultimately, with our developed energy efficiency multiplier for the region, we're able to calculate how many jobs would be created through the spending associated with the levels of energy efficiency improvements that are included in our clean energy pathway. We also looked at how energy efficiency enables residential bill savings through reduced consumption. Households are spending less of their disposable income on energy. So if we were to assume that instead folks would be spending those savings elsewhere in the local economy, that would create additional economic activity in the region. So we also model the impact of those bill savings as induced effects of household spending, which has its own specific multiplier in the data. So through this analysis, we found that by 2050, energy efficiency investments in our pathway would support more than 15,000 annual jobs, which is a pretty strong bang for your buck here. And for comparison, we looked at energy efficiency, we looked at the jobs multiplier in relation to multipliers in the BEA data to see just how strong that impact is. And we see that the multiplier for efficiency is 151% higher than the economic multiplier for electric power generation. And that means that the job creation potential is more than 2.5 times greater, right? So we see that energy efficiency is not only a cost-effective alternative to utility scale generation for meeting local load, but it can also be a more powerful driver for economic development. And this is true in comparison to other energy-related industries in the region, including coal mining and oil and gas extraction. We see a higher jobs multiplier for investments in efficiency. We also see a higher labor income multiplier, which means that energy efficiency expenditures are also leading to higher paying jobs in the region. And just one final point here is that most energy efficiency improvements can typically be performed by local workforce. Things like upgrades in lighting, insulation, doors and windows, heating and cooling system. Those are tasks that are likely going to be supporting jobs for contractors and suppliers who are already located within the region. So hyper local impact there. And so, look, I know I spent a lot of time on this slide, but you know, these are some pretty interesting findings, and I think that potentially a really compelling case, particularly as we're discussing a transition towards decarbonization, and folks are going to be making decisions that impact the future of the region's economic health. This is an area that's been very heavily focused on the fossil fuel industry. So this analysis suggests the importance of maybe considering some other alternatives for local development, local economic development, I should say. So let's step back here. I just want to summarize the findings of our research here. Focusing primarily on the power sector, we've developed a clean energy pathway with a limited role for fossil fuels and instead focused on zero emissions resources, imports from PJM, and significant energy efficiency improvements. And our analysis finds that the pathway is 13% less expensive than an alternative based around natural gas paired with carbon capture to abate emissions. Electrification of buildings and vehicles enables decarbonization of those industries as well. And in total, the impact of our pathway leads to annual environmental and health benefits of more than $4 billion by 2050 through avoided social costs of carbon. And energy efficiency allows us to limit electric load growth to 33% over the period through 2050, while also providing a pretty strong opportunity for economic development impacts through local job creation. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage all of you to please take a look at our report. It was released today and goes into more detail than I'm able to go into in this webinar, but happy to answer any questions during our Q&A session as part of this discussion. And also feel free to reach out to me or Eliaseed with any follow-up questions. I've included our email addresses here on this slide. So thank you all so much. And with that, I'll hand it back to Joanne.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe and Eliaseed. And I know there's been a lot of chatter in the Q&A and in the chat. So we are definitely going to get to some of these specific questions, but before we do, I'd like to invite Sean O'Leary to join our panel. And I'd like to pose to you all sort of a threshold question, kind of taking a step back. What is the significance and importance of this report and releasing it at this particular time when decarbonization is kind of at the forefront of public policy discourse?
Well, thank you, Joanne, and thank you, Joe and Eliaseed, for the really remarkable work that you've done on this study. You know, Joanne, in response to your question, I think the significance of this is that right now, our region is at a moment of truth with respect not to whether we're going to decarbonize, because we are, as the rest of the country and the rest of the world will, but the question is what route or pathway will decarbonization take? And there's frankly been a rush to judgment in the region. We've seen a variety of reports coming out that propose to do decarbonization primarily on the back of fossil fuel industries, assisted primarily by carbon capture and sequestration. And I think the importance of Joe and Eliaseed's work and the work of their teams is that it reminds us that in some cases, we may have arrived at an answer before we actually researched the question. And that question is, if we're thinking about decarbonization, what we're trying to answer is, how can we decarbonize most effectively? How can we achieve the greatest level of reduction in carbon emissions and do so at the least cost and with the greatest positive impact on job creation? And what excites me about this report is that it shows us that if those are the criteria that we're trying to meet, then a clean energy pathway rather than a dirty energy decarbonization pathway is much more effective. And I would hope as we go forward, particularly at the state government level, that we will step back from the headlong rush to hydrogen hubs and carbon capture to ask ourselves that most fundamental question: how can we do this in a way that achieves the greatest reduction at the least cost and with the best impact on jobs and prosperity for our region? And so with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. And another sort of just quick threshold question for Joe and Eliaseed is, what does this report tell us about what is possible to achieve in the context of decarbonization in a region that has a long history of being an extraction-based economy?
Sure, yeah, and I'll allow Eliaseed to chime in as well, but I think, you know, the real lesson to take away from this too is that, you know, we've conducted some analysis on the feasibility here, and I think this is kind of in reference to what Sean just pointed to also, that you know, I think this suggests that, you know, there's other pathways out there than just this existing narrative, even for a region that has so much history of fossil, but this existing narrative that, you know, to decarbonize, it has to include doubling down on fossil and then therefore heavier investments in other technologies to then abate emissions, right? And so our analysis shows that, look, there is another potential pathway here, and, you know, one that might avoid additional expensive and widespread infrastructure build out for that CCS infrastructure. So, you know, I think that part of what we would look at here from a clean energy planning perspective is that for effective energy transition, you know, what are ways that you can focus on some no regret strategies with proven technologies that are already in existence today to help minimize the risk of potential stranded costs from investments that are being made in the near term for decisions out to 2050. So, Eliaseed, anything else to add there?
Thanks, Joe. No, I'll simply add that, as you say, like the potential for this change is pretty big, and just for you to have a reference, we use cost approximations that, you know, lean to the conservative side. So, you know, it's just a lot of potential to untap there, especially with the benefits provided by the federal level.
Yeah, and I'll also, Sorry, Sean, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add that I think there's one other important distinction between the pathway you and Eliasid have laid out and the one being offered by a variety of groups within Pennsylvania. And that is that the pathway you've sketched here is consistent with achieving a standard of restraining global warming to a level of 1.5 degrees centigrade, which right now is the global goal toward which we're all working. And those alternative pathways, those dirty energy pathways, even they admit that they would not achieve that standard. And I think that is a really important distinguishing characteristic, in addition to the cost savings and in addition to the job growth advantages that are associated with the pathway that you've laid out.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I think given the kind of volume of questions that we have, I'll transition us into the Q&A. And again, for everyone who's participating, I have a list of all the questions that you've asked, as well as who asked the question. So in the event that we are not able to answer your question live, we will follow up, or feel free to follow up with us if we don't get to your question quickly enough. There are a couple of categories of questions so far. So we've had some technical questions about the analysis. We've had some questions about policy and broader context, also questions about workforce and our look at kind of specific workforce pathways. So one kind of overarching comment I'd like to make before we get into the specific Q&A is that we recognize that this analysis is not going to answer all of the questions that we or the broader community have about our very significant decarbonization kind of challenge in the region and more broadly across the country. So we do have a section in the report that talks about a need for further analysis and that this is a technical pathway and it's not intended to serve all functions, but really to provide some context to the conversation about what else is possible from a technical perspective. So I just wanted to add that kind of general comment that we know that this report can't do everything, but we are really excited about what it contributes to the conversation. So I'd like to start with a few of the technical questions. There was one from Shanti, which was, could you explain perhaps a little more slowly how you figured out the predicted available generation in Pennsylvania? So looking at the slide with the map of generators in the PJM system. So I don't know who wants to take that, Joe or Eliasid.
I'll let Eliasid go ahead and do it because I fear that I rushed him by telling him we were limited to a certain amount of time. So he might have gone through that slide a little quickly. So I'll give him the opportunity to expand a little bit more.
Thanks. Yeah, and I included a map which it doesn't fully explain our methodology. The map was showing only like currently proposed renewable projects in the PJM territory. So we use that only as as a benchmark. To kind of make sure that our assumptions were realistic and the location of the resources we were looking at were realistic too. But actually what we did was using another available and publicly available tool developed by NREL. These are called the renewable supply curves. They have these for solar and wind. It's actually a GIS, a geographical information system based model, which allows us to basically, like map down all the capacity that is technically available in the US. Also, like looking at their capacity factors and other attributes of that capacity, and basically, define some boundaries for what's local capacity, and then like doing some math to go from technical potential into like economical and then achievable potential, and that was our upper boundary, which was fed into the model, the analysis. And so that was for the local generation. For the wider like PAM potential to develop new renewables, we tried to look at existing literature. We actually like relied on actual models that were conducted, just to see scenarios where we as a country achieve the decarbonization goals. And in that context, like how much energy could be realistically deployed or economically deployed across the PM territory. We again like did some in-house modeling to size that to a capacity of renewables that could be uptaken by the region, and that's how we again like set upper boundaries for our model. So those boundaries were weighted against our capacity for transmission constraints, and then, as I explained before, we did an iterative process where we tried out different combinations of resources to arrive to our preferred portfolio. Hopefully that's a detailed explanation.
Great, thank you. And then a couple of other technical questions that came from Tony and Grafia. One was, what was the assumption for the likelihood of CCUS or CCS at required scale? And the second was, what assumption was used on methane impact on climate change?
I'll answer the second piece first. I think we didn't specifically, and Sean, I'll welcome you to chime in as well. We didn't specifically track methane. We did CO2 equivalent, primarily for the power sector, for that natural gas consumption and potential drop in production piece. We did look at just the impact of, based on the research from Carnegie Mellon, it was looking at the what is the cost of those damages? What is the environmental cost? And that did that analysis, Carnegie Mellon's analysis, did incorporate damages associated with methane. So we incorporated it in that calculation, but from the power sector side of it, because we didn't really we looked at buildings and transportation, but we didn't really examine the industrial sector. So.
Yeah, and with respect to carbon capture, basically carbon capture does not appear particularly, although it could arrive in the industrial sector. Carbon capture is not present in our scenario in the power generating sector. And the reason for that is fairly straightforward, and that is that it's hopelessly uneconomic. In the case of natural gas generated electricity, the implementation of carbon capture would more than double the cost. And in the case of coal powered generation, it would more than triple the cost. And so as a consequence, it really does not appear as a factor in the results that you see in this study.
Yeah, I will add that we did model like the cost of carbon capture for the comparison case, just like our portfolio versus an alternative. And for that, we even included the benefits that IRA gives to carbon capture technologies, along with costs of the related infrastructure that comes with carbon capture. And even assuming those benefits for carbon capture, we did end up finding that a cleaner pathway was more cost effective.
Great. While we're kind of in the technical space, there's a question from Paul Goff, who asks, can you talk about why you focused on the power sector and not modeling the industrial sector, including the so-called hard to decarbonize sectors like steel, glass, and cement that are prevalent in Southwestern Pennsylvania? And as a follow-up to that, do you see a role for hydrogen or other technology in those sectors?
I love this question. Want to take it, Joe?
Sure, I'll jump in, and then Sean and Eliasid, you're welcome to chime in as well with additional color. But yeah, I think, look, we're power sector experts anyway, but we look at these other sectors too, because to look at the impact on how that will affect electricity load. And, I think the question really hit the nail on the head here. These are sectors that are considered hard to abate. And you're not going to electrify all steel, right? I mean, there are some existing electric arc furnaces, but that's not going to be the only solution here. So we were looking at other industries and how they impact the electric sector specifically. And so, I think a lot of us accept that we'll probably need some role for hydrogen, for green hydrogen, to fully decarbonize and eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from those other sectors. But LAC, you got really excited by this, but Sean, I want to make sure I give you an opportunity to address it as well. But
no, I thank you. Yeah, with respect to industrial, there is an immense opportunity to make progress in that region. That said, I should point out that the power generating sector is responsible for about 3/4 of all of the carbon emissions that come out of the region, which is why it was the focal point for greater emphasis going on. Having said that, there are significant opportunities to decarbonize those hard to electrify sectors. And hydrogen and even carbon capture in some cases, but hydrogen in particular is particularly promising in those regions. Although, with particularly the support of the IRA, the hydrogen that would be used and would be most cost effective at abating those sectors is green hydrogen derived from electrolysis and water rather than blue hydrogen from natural gas.
Great. Thank you all so much. We have another question that is kind of related to the background of the pathway, coming from John Hurdle. So is the pathway based on experience elsewhere? And if so, where and what were the results?
I think we approached this for this 10-county region specific for the region, which is why we tried to do everything locally. We didn't necessarily, we followed sort of best practices for energy transition. I mentioned before that, part of that is relying on existing technologies and, some no regrets investments. But specifically for the power sector piece of it, we didn't model it specifically off for any other existing plan. I think, Sean, you may want to speak on the experience in Centralia with energy efficiency and potential for economic transition. I think that's some research that we thought about, and particularly in doing the jobs analysis piece that we did for energy efficiency. But
yeah, those of you who follow the Ohio River Valley Institute may recall that, as Joe just alluded to, about a year ago, we issued a report on the clean energy transition of a town called Centralia, Washington, not Pennsylvania. And it's a significant example because it was a town that was a coal town, first of all. Its largest employers were a coal-fired power plant and coal mine. One of the mine has closed and the power plant's in the process of closing. And that community implemented a clean energy transition plan with about $55 million in funding, and they achieved truly remarkable results in job growth and economic growth and population growth as well. And in probably in January, maybe February, we will be releasing another report on Centralia, which actually is the product of the Ohio State University School of Economics, in which they will examine not only the amount of job growth and economic prosperity that's being achieved in Centralia, but they will also look at the causal relationship between clean energy transition and why the kind of transition that took place in Centralia, and which is also described in Joe and Eliasid's report, is so effective as a means of stimulating job growth and economic prosperity, as compared to the natural gas industry and fossil fuel power generation, which are very poor foundations upon which to build economic prosperity and job growth, which of course we've seen as a region since the beginning of the natural gas boom, which of course I think we all know now has yielded effectively zero job growth in the region.
Thank you. While we're on the topic of jobs, there's a question from Matt Barron, which is, do you have an estimate for net job creation by 2050 via the clean energy pathway that takes into account jobs that may be lost from fossil fuel related industries, or is the 15,000 figure net jobs?
Yeah, that 15,000 is not net, and that's only specifically jobs created through energy efficiency investments. So it's not even covering all of the jobs created through our pathway. It's solely focused on energy efficiency. And part of the reason, and the reason I mentioned the Centralia work, is to really look at, hey, what could the potential be from investments in energy efficiency, not only as an alternative to utility scale generation for meeting load, but also for local economic development. And so, yeah, that 15,000 number is just for energy efficiency. We didn't, as part of the scope of the study, we didn't do a full, complete net jobs analysis for every industry.
Thank you. We do have a couple of questions that are related to kind of modeling pathways for workforce and skills development, and also collaborating with and really anticipating the role of unions and labor organizations in this work. And I just wanted to make a quick editorial note from the non-technical side that I think, as we continue to focus on decarbonization in the region and, trying to explore more of the specific job and workforce training pathways, as well as some of the additional policy levers that would be needed to enable this kind of technical pathway to emerge. Those are things that are areas of further study and further work. But I just did want to make sure to name those things because they've come up several times in the Q&A, and they are issues that we do take seriously and are contemplating as we move forward with our research contributions in this field. And then we are coming up on the end of our session, but there are still some unanswered questions. And I think maybe Sean, I'll pose this to you, which is a sort of general question related to further engagement around the study. So there were a couple of questions, one specifically about outreach to the Department of Energy, and one about outreach to other policymakers and decision makers in the community. So would you mind just speaking briefly to our approach to contributing this report to that process and dialogue?
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. We, and I'm meaning ORVI at the moment, but ORVI in combination with a number of advocacy organizations, academics, and other people in the region are making a concerted effort to reach out to policymakers at both the state and local level, whether state representatives and senators or county commissioners and mayors, to talk with them really about two things. One, of course, is clean energy transition and the alternative pathways that are available to us, and the urgent need to examine all of the options on the table rather than rushing headlong to doing the thing that looks like it produces more natural gas production. The second thing that we're talking to them about, though, is what we were discussing a minute ago, which is the clean energy transition strategy and its potential as an economic development platform, which is vitally important. And so over the coming year, ORVI is going to continue to meet with people and, in fact, I think expand our outreach. We've actually added to our staff in a couple of areas to focus specifically on economic development and marrying economic development with clean energy transition so that, our region can join the rest of the country in enjoying the benefits of the transition to clean energy resources.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sean. And I'd like to extend another thanks to Joe and Eliasid from Strategen. We're extremely grateful for your research and analysis here and for joining us today to share this with our community. I'd also like to thank all of the attendees who joined. We had excellent participation, and we really appreciate everyone's engagement with this report. We do have a full list of questions and who posed them, so we'll make sure to follow up if we didn't get to your question, and feel free to reach out to us if there's anything else that comes up or if any other questions come to mind after the session. And again, thank you all so much. Thanks to our presenters, and any last words, you're welcome to share.
I'll just say thank you again to Orvi for hosting this discussion and helping to enable this research. We're really excited about this work and the release of the report today. So thank you all.
Thank you.